Welcome to Aspire, and I Have the Right To podcast, where we amplify voices, share stories, and drive change in the fight against sexual assault. We explore the critical issues surrounding student safety, institutional accountability, and survivor empowerment. In every episode, our goal is to provide insightful conversations with survivors, experts, educators, and advocates, giving you, our listener, valuable information, resources, and actionable steps to create safer environments and cultivate a culture of respect and consent. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the I Have the Right To Aspire podcast. We're so glad you're here with us. I'm Katie Shipp, and as always, I'm joined by my amazing co-host and the founder of I Have the Right To, Chessy Prout.
Hi, everyone. We're so glad you're tuning in, and we're so excited for today's conversation.
We're also thrilled to welcome back our student voice and co-host, Maria Halter, a student at Georgetown University. Maria brings the thoughtful perspectives of young people into these conversations, and we're grateful to have her here with us.
And today we have a truly special guest joining us, Dena Moes. Dena is a registered nurse, certified nurse midwife, and author whose work is deeply rooted in equity, justice, and dignity in reproductive care. She holds a BA in Literature and Women's Studies and a master's degree in nurse midwifery from Yale University.
Dena's newest book, It's Your Body, is a judgment-free, inclusive guide that empowers young women to truly understand their bodies, how they work, how to care for them, and how to advocate for themselves with confidence. It's an essential resource that every young woman should have, offering clear, accessible information grounded in Dena's decades of experience supporting teens and young adults. Dena, we're so grateful to have you with us today. Welcome to the Aspire podcast.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to join you all today for this conversation.
We're so happy you were able to make it today, Dena. To get started, I was wondering if you could speak to what inspired you to write such an accessible but also informative book on such an overlooked topic.
Yeah, so my book is about empowered sexual health for young women. It's called It's Your Body. And I was inspired to write it after Roe versus Wade was overturned in 2022. Roe versus Wade was the decision by the Supreme Court that made abortion legal in the United States of America. And it was overturned in 2022. During that time, I was working at an incredible free feminist health center in Chico, California called Women's Health Specialists, where I provided reproductive care to mainly college students as well as adolescents and young adults primarily. And during my 6 years at the clinic, I helped thousands of women learn about their bodies, get on birth control, have agency over whether or not they became mothers, and at that time, and learned how to take care of themselves regarding sexual activity and sexual health. So when Roe versus Wade was overturned, I thought about all the places in the United States where women might not have access to a clinic like the one I worked in, and I decided to put as much as I could the topics that I counseled my patients at my clinic into a book so anyone could access them.
The entire time I was reading your book, I kept thinking, wow, I really wish I had this when I was younger. And also that this really should be required reading for all girls and young women, and also those who are raising them. I actually sent your book to a few of the moms and dads I know of young girls who aren't quite, at this age yet, but told them to read it so that they were ready when they were. So I would really love to hear from you. What age would you recommend young people pick up this book? What age should parents be buying this for their kids? What age should they be reading it themselves so that they're ready with resources and tools? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I really was writing it with a college student aged person in mind, but honestly, it's really appropriate for high school students and basically anyone who's going to be starting to get messaging about what sexual activity is and exposed to any kind of explicit material on the internet or just going through puberty. So I think it's for ages about 13 and up. Because kids are going to be exposed to things. And usually sex ed happens in middle school. So that's at around that age, 12, 13, with the onset of puberty. Anything up from there, I think, is appropriate because education is power. And this gives clear and unbiased information with which young people can then approach their own, what they're taking in from the media and the society and what they are doing in their own lives.
Yeah, and there's something to be said too about having the information before it's necessarily applicable to your life. So you understand, like, okay, as I get older, here are ways for me to think about my body and relationships and healthcare. So yeah, I just think it's such an important book.
Yeah, so I wrote it. It's a small book. It's a little tiny thing, and I didn't include every topic under the sun in it. So it's very specific about what are all the methods of birth control, what are all the STIs, and how can I prevent getting them, or what should I do if I think I'm exposed? And then other aspects of sexual health, which I know we're going to talk about today: agency, boundaries, consent, what is female sexual pleasure, and what to do if you find yourself pregnant. So it's a small volume. It's not an encyclopedia of everything about puberty onward. And I made it that way so that it's really easy to flip through. I know a lot of parents of teens are buying a copy and just kind of leaving it in the house, not making a big deal about, aha, here's a book for you to read, but rather it's lying around. Someone's likely to pick it up, flip it through, like, oh, what is a menstrual cycle? Oh, what is herpes? Can teenagers use IUDs, and just kind of flip through it and find their information as they are inspired to look.
Well, I've got to say that the cover art as well makes it such a beautiful book to just leave around. I mean, ours is on our coffee table at our house. So it's really, really incredible that this is such a, not just the beautiful cover, but such a wonderful toolkit for young people. And even at age 27, I learned more about my menstrual cycle through your work. And I also really, really appreciated the fact that you consistently emphasized that there's no such thing as normal, that your normal looks different than somebody else's normal, which that sort of accessible and inclusive language felt really important to me. What was it? Why was it so important for you to have that sort of language in there? And how did you come to learn about or come to implement that sort of inclusivity?
Well, I really learned that through my job as a midwife and a healthcare provider for teenagers. And I really love the clinic that I worked at. Has a vision, which is a world where women control their own bodies, reproduction, and sexuality, and providing women-controlled healthcare. And only with dignity and freedom of choice can women achieve their full potential. And we treated everyone as a consenting person with agency who came into our clinic, no matter what their age. So if they were 12, if they were 13, and they came in for birth control or some other sexual health need, they were treated the same way anyone was treated, with compassion, with integrity, with clear and unbiased assistance. And so I really learned to do that. And I found that, so sex is an adult activity with potentially adult consequences. So we treated anyone, including teenagers, like adults when they come in. And I find everybody, no matter what their age, responds better when treated with respect and treated as a person with agency. And so that's just how I am as a midwife and a healthcare provider. And I wanted to make that the voice in my book too, so that if someone was reading us, they felt like they were talking to a trusted healthcare provider.
Oh, that's wonderful. And, the motto of I Have the Right To, part of our mission is that we believe that safety of students begins with building respect. And to kind of segue from your book chapter, I was interested in hearing more about why it was so important to include the chapter, the ABCs of healthy sexual self-agency, boundaries, and consent, and how that sort of ties into conversations about your reproductive health and sexual pleasure and owning your agency in that sort of situation as well.
Yeah, so, I'm an expert on contraception. That's kind of, what I do all day at the clinic. And so writing the part of the book that explains all the birth control methods, pros and cons, things to consider when trying to pick a birth control method was really easy for me. And but my heart really lies with the chapter, the ABCs, agency, boundaries, and consent of sexual health. Because that's the foundation for everything else. So it was really, I'll never forget how, I was researching and trying to figure out how to write and impart what I wanted to impart, which is that a healthy sexual life starts with agency, being able to decide what you want to do, when you want to do it, to learn how to listen to your own body, telling you what feels good, what doesn't feel good, what is a yes, what's not a yes, and trying to infuse the next generation with the principles of consent in all ways, because you've probably heard or spoken yourself that we live in sort of a rape culture, or we live in a rape culture, and where some people think they're entitled to take what they want from other people. And we want to build a culture of consent where permission and agreements and respect are the foundations for all interactions among people. And so, I write about that because I know it's very confusing for young women when they are beginning to have sexual feelings. They become interested in boys or sexual partners, but they may not be clear about what they actually want from those interactions. It's just exciting, but and that's where I think it can be so confusing. And I know when I was that age, I had confusing, dangerous, unpleasant interactions as I was trying to figure out what is it that I want. And so that chapter sets the foundation for making your own toolkit to figure out, well, what if we made an agreement before we go out? Like, I do want to kiss you tonight, but I do want to keep my clothes on, or, whatever it is, just learning how to sort of set some safe boundaries before the heat of the moment arises, and you may not be sure how to handle that.
That's so excellent, Dena. I really appreciate how you specify agency. And in your book, you write, agency is what we are going for in our sexual relationships. Having boundaries and using principles of consent is how we get there. I guess you kind of already talked on this, but could you differentiate how that might be, how agency, boundaries, and consent might be seen differently between like a high school age versus a college age versus like going out into the world?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much the same for all those, but I can break them down a little bit. And I also want to say that if a person has a history of violation or trauma, it can be harder to know your own boundaries and explore the edges. So I describe boundaries as those places, those edges between what is okay and what is not okay. And if a person has had some kind of trauma or physical violation, sometimes it's really hard to read those within yourself because you kind of aren't as connected to your body feelings, and that's one of your strategies for coping. So, so I just want to say, if that's the case of anyone listening, to maybe use some therapy. There are some therapeutic modalities that can help you. And so to get to a place where you can really hear those boundaries. And so I used to do a workshop with my friends and all of our daughters when our daughters were in like fourth, fifth, sixth grade, and we called it Mother-Daughter Body Safety Circle. And we would talk about finding your no. And even as an adult, I realized I still need to do that sometimes in a workplace where someone's pressuring me to do things that I actually don't want to do, but I do it anyway because I just have that want to please everybody mentality that overrides my inner no. And so this is really a life skill that can be applied anywhere and everywhere. And I think it's part of the dismantling of patriarchy that women learn how to use our boundaries in all aspects. And if we practice it elsewhere, it becomes easier in sexual encounters or in, interpersonal, potentially romantic encounters. So there's a lot of messaging and there's a lot of thinking that goes on in our heads, but our bodies can often tell us when there's a no, and you usually get a feeling in the pit of your stomach, like, God, I don't want to sit next to that guy, and you just feel it in your gut. And so that's a gut feeling. And so the first place to start finding where are your boundaries is being able to check in with that gut feeling. Like it's a sinking stone or it's a clench or it's just a feeling in the pit of your stomach that you don't want to do something. That's your inner no. And it's also good to just practice saying no. So when I did that group activity with the fourth, fifth, and sixth graders, we'd all stand up and we'd just scream no. Because to counteract all the yes, ma'am, yes, mama, yes, teacher, yes, blah, 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 that we're so trained to do. So let's practice our no. And we can start with small things like this friend wants us to loan them $20, and the last time they never paid us back. So what if you just said no? And so that's kind of the practice. And it can be, for all ages. We all need to continually work on that as we go through life, and we have different expectations as, we go from a student to an employee to maybe a husband or a wife. Like, we still have the capacity to hold boundaries. And in my book, I do talk about situations where that becomes extra difficult when there's a power differential, such as teacher-student, or if your boss is trying to get you to go out on a date with them, it's really hard to say no because you're worried that something's going to happen to you at work, or someone's much older than you, twice your age, and they're your parents' friend, and so you feel like, it's not polite to say no. And of course, if you're under the influence of alcohol or drugs, it is legally considered you are not able to give consent. And so that's something to consider. Like, a huge part of safety for college age people is if you're going to go out and use substances or go out drinking, that you have friends with you, and that is not the time to initiate a sexual interaction because you're not able to give consent. You might not remember, and you're really at risk. The more intoxicated you are, actually, the more at risk you are of being assaulted or violated in some way. And so, all of those issues come into play. And if you are a student or an employee and you're being harassed by someone or asked out, or your interactions are hitting that boundary where you're like, this doesn't feel right, I suggest you get help, because that's more for you to handle on your own than you may be capable of. And there should be other teachers, there should be a principal, there should be a human resources or a supervisor of a department. And so don't try to handle things on your own when they feel like they're going past your boundary and you don't know what to do. Like, there's help. So you need support. And that's not a judgment on you. That's just a human situation.
Yeah, we all have moments in life, and I think almost every day it should be that we need support and guidance and conversation and friendship. And I think it's important also to remember that if the first person you go to belittles you and or downplays what you've gone through, just keep going until you do find somebody who gives it the weight that it deserves. Because there will be somebody who will be there to listen and help you get through it. But hearing you talk about the saying no and needing to practice that reminded me of an episode that we taped with Meg Stone, the author of The Cost of Fear. I mentioned to her that over the summer, my sister had taken a self-defense course, and she brought her learnings back to me and my sisters and said, yeah, just like you taught in your mother-daughter class, they had the students practice saying no. There's so much power in practicing the words out loud. I feel like it can feel silly at times, but actually training your mouth to remember that no is a full sentence, that no is something that is not supremely hurtful or like offensive to people. No is a positive boundary that you can set, and I think it's helpful to remind people that no is not always a bad thing. And you write about this in your book as well, about how we have to train ourselves to hear no, not just to say no, but to also hear it and to accept it as something that is, wow, thank you for setting a boundary for yourself. I loved that line in your book. I was like, wow, that helps me rephrase the way that I hear no from my sisters when I want to go get food at one place and they say no. I'm like, actually, you know what? Good for you for setting a boundary. And it also reminded me of a trend on the internet where partners in heteronormative relationships the male partners would often ask their female partners, where do you want to go eat? And the women say, well, anywhere is fine. And then the men will keep asking questions and it'll be a no, 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 no. That sort of situation felt like it encapsulated the crossroads of coercion and hearing and saying no, which made me think about the sort of confusion and sort of reminded me of the spectrum on which hearing and saying no exists, and also the spectrum of that feeling in our guts. You mentioned how having experienced a traumatic sexual experience can impact the way that we move forward in our lives, especially as sexual beings. But I've recognized in my own personal experience that sometimes that anxiety response and that gut feeling will come up in any and all stressful situations or anticipatory situations. Do you have any advice for people who might not trust their gut as much anymore because of the things that we've had to be on high alert for throughout our lives?
Right. That's a really good question. Thank you. I think it just little by little, learning to trust your gut. And I think anyone who has a lot of anxiety can have that experience where they don't trust their own inner response. And so I think that's true for a lot of people, no matter their history. That's a problem that we have. And so it's just little by little. And doing it again and again, coming back to it. And the thing is so consent should be very enthusiastic and specific. And this is the other thing, is that if it's a wiffle waffle, if it's a not sure, when it comes to anything sexual, that should be a no, because anything sexual activity is very intimate, it's very vulnerable and private. And so we say, if it's not a F word yes, then it's a no. And that's a really good place to start, because there's no harm in saying no. There's no harm in saying no to a cheeseburger and then later going, God, maybe I would have liked a cheeseburger. Okay, so that happened, you can get a cheeseburger another time. And So just building that trust in yourself, just giving yourself permission to explore those edges, I think, and to say no more than yes if you feel like you can't trust yourself, will build trust back for you. Because once you see, okay, so the consequence of saying no here is that we held hands to go walk around the block and I came home safely. I do want to see this person again. I might want to get more physical with them. And if they're worth my time, they'll, make a second date, a third date. It doesn't all have to happen right away. And I think that when I was preparing for this podcast and I was thinking about all these topics, I think the most important thing is that we can slow everything down. I think that the social media culture and the attention deficit culture, everything seems like it has to happen fast. And like even the way they make reels on social media, it's like everything happens within 30 seconds. Done. And it's like, we don't have to live that way. We can slow down. And that really ties back to female sexual pleasure, because you cannot rush arousal in a female. And that's the problem with pornography and all the messaging on social media is like, how do women and female-bodied people enjoy sex? By going slow, slowing it down. The female sexual arousal response is complicated and it takes time to develop. And one should not have intercourse until one is fully aroused. And so, anyway, that's a different topic, veered off, but connected, that I just think the overall message of take your time and slow down, explore the edges, make agreements will all support a more healthy and thereby meaningful, satisfying, and pleasurable experience for people.
My mom always tells me and my sisters that there's nothing more exciting than holding hands with somebody for the first time. And I think that's so true. And so that's part of the reason why I'm so excited to continue my work with I Have the Right to and in the film and television industry, which is where I do my professional work outside of the organization. And one of my favorite movies this year was the movie Sorry Baby, directed and written by Eva Victor. It's such a beautiful film, but they have one of the most thoughtful and realistic and trauma-informed and just beautiful scenes of the main character finally realizing her own sort of agency. And it makes me so encouraged for the future of at least independent films, that they can show these smaller moments and show what female agency actually looks like, especially after trauma. That's the framework of that film. I would recommend anybody watch it. It's just amazing.
I think I've seen a trailer for that twice or three times. I've been like, what's that movie? That looks amazing. So thank you for reminding me to check that out. I wanted to just add one more thing about consent, which wasn't in my book and which I really like to share whenever I do a podcast, which is that consent, we use the acronym FRIES, and maybe you guys already use this in your work, but FRIES stands for freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. And that I also just want to remind everybody listening that just because you did something one time does not mean you necessarily are obligated to do it again. And there's nothing that you can wear, no amount of makeup, no history, no previous relationships that mean you owe anything to anybody, as well as being told I love you, being taken for an expensive dinner, being given gifts. None of those things mean you are obligated to have sex or have any physical intimacy with anybody in return. So I just wanted to put that reminder out there.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. And it really is such a great definition of consent. So at I Have the Right To, we provide programming to K through 12 schools, college and university students, as well as educators and parents. And while your book talks about relationships once they've turned sexual in nature, these same terms can be used much earlier in different contexts like boundaries and friendships, and how to help people understand how they should be treated and how to treat others. And one of the things that I was sort of thinking about as I was finishing your book was the role for healthcare providers in these discussions. So we, talk to parents, we talk to educators, we talk to young people, but I also think that there can be such an important part that healthcare providers play in that. And, talking about consent with their patients. I mean, I'm thinking, anytime I go into like my annual appointment at the OBGYN, they say, are you safe at home? But I've never had any of them ever talk to me about anything more than that, like where they dive in and talk to me about, are the relationships you're in healthy or consent or anything like that. And I just kind of wanted to know what you think the role that healthcare providers have and what part they can play in that. Should it be a part of the conversation and at what age? I know with my son and his pediatrician and my daughter, before they get a physical, the doctor sort of, ask them for their consent before they look at their body. But just, as we get older, is there a role for healthcare professionals in these conversations as well?
Well, I think that's a great question. The problem is, I think, is that adolescents sort of slip through the cracks of healthcare because they really should be seen by a pediatrician until they're 18. And I think, pediatricians have a lot going on. So, they're taking care of newborn babies. Is that baby jaundiced? Is that baby, feeding well? Is it growing? This kid has the measles, oh my God, and so they're just already like really stacked. And I think a lot of teenagers stop going to a pediatrician because they're like, oh, I don't want to go see that doctor. So I feel like in the kind of setting that I worked in California at like a women's health clinic or a Planned Parenthood clinic, that is a great place for teenagers, especially regarding these kind of topics, because that's our specialty. And what I do in my patient visits is you have to kind of let the patient lead. Like, if you pry too much, especially in a teenager, they're going to shut down or get defensive or not want to talk to you. So like what I found at my clinic as a healthcare provider is whatever's going on, I kind of let them sort of start spilling the beans. And then when it's appropriate, talk more. But I certainly think that information about consent and boundaries and sexual safety should be given out. And I know like Planned Parenthood does have brochures and things about these topics for their younger patients. And, so it really depends, and some people just want to be very private about their business too, which is why it's so important to be a respectful and safe place for people to come and not feel like, oh, I'm going to be asked all these questions that I don't want to be asked. So it can be a delicate issue, like how much to go in. So I always let the patient lead. And when I have a teenager with their mom in the room, I often say, can we have a few minutes with mom stepped out of the room? And sometimes a person will want to share more when their mom isn't listening. So
thank you so much, Dena. I feel like, especially for like moving into this next topic and question, I feel like this is definitely something that my generation has had to navigate around for so long, and without really being able to talk about it with adults in a comfortable setting, it can be really difficult. And that topic is porn, and also sharing like nudes or sexually explicit photos. I feel like my generation and those younger than me definitely are definitely the generation who grew up with phones and iPads and constant communication. And while that can be great to some extent, I feel like it can also be very harmful in other ways. And it's now more available than ever. And recent research also suggests that the average age young people watch porn for the first time is about 10 for boys and 12 for girls, which is quite young. So can you talk briefly about how this may impact healthy sexual development and consent in relationships?
Yeah, I can. And thank you for bringing these topics up. Unfortunately, the news about these topics is not positive. Pornography is not a healthy way to learn about sex, period. And it is really unsettling how young people are now when they're first being exposed to it, and how explicit and how much there is. So, I remember when I was in high school, we would sneak into the magazine shop and open a Playgirl magazine and look at a male naked body and be like, ah, scream and run out of the store. And now it's just so much more extreme, with a lot of like very extreme kinds of sexual activity, just right there on the internet for anyone to find. And so the problem with porn, there's a few problems with porn. One of them is that it's made for what's called the male gaze. So it objectifies women as spectacles for male pleasure, and it's not accurate. It's not an accurate depiction of like what satisfying sex is between two people. It's more like fulfilling a male's fantasy of what sex might be like. And so the problem with watching it as a kid before you have discernment and critical thinking is that, you kind of think that that's what sex is supposed to look like. And that can be very harmful. And that's why in my book, I go into female sexual pleasure and even learning how to masturbate and find your own sexual pleasure, because learning your own body and what feels good is a tool that then you can bring into exploring what feels good with a partner. Yeah, so pornography really is a problem. And, I don't have an answer to it, because it's like the Pandora's box has been opened, but it is an unfortunate situation. I do know that there are some websites where women are making pornography. There's one where women can send in their sexual fantasies and they will film them for them and then put them on the internet. And so, at least to show what would actually be pleasurable for a woman, that's a positive step. But the often violent and aggressive kinds of sex that you see on porn is just not really accurate and is harmful. So and then in terms of nude and explicit photos, I mentioned this in my book too. I do not recommend ever sharing nude pictures with someone, because the problem is they're not yours anymore after that. And once you've given someone a picture of yourself, you can never get it back, and they have it. And there's terrible reports, and there have been cases where people have really violated other people by sharing their nude photos. And, and you could think, oh, this guy loves me, he would never do that. Well, what would happen after you broke up? Does it turn out he is an angry person? He just has never gotten angry at you yet, So it's really hard to think through all the possible scenarios that someone might be tempted to share your picture or try to harm you by doing that. And it is illegal and against the law, but it's very hard to manage it. Like, people do it anyway because it's hard to find the source. And once it's out, it can spiral out of control. So, I would say to anybody, male or female, don't share a nude picture. Like, it's a really bad idea, and it's not worth the trouble. And if someone only wants to be with you, if you share a nude picture with them, that's coercion. And you don't want to be in a relationship with someone who has that, who's going to coerce you and tell you have to do things that you don't want to do. And so I feel terrible for people who've been harmed. I know people who've been harmed by this, and both those things, again, like slowing down, getting off the internet, exploring healthy relationships, exploring self-love, are all ways to give your generation the tools to navigate healthy relationships despite all this exposure that you've already had.
That is a great reminder to slow down. I think it's important for people also to remember that something as easy as sending a quick picture, or sort of the immediacy of the ability to send a photo to somebody, is not conducive to a thoughtful conversation. That sort of intimate act of sharing a piece of yourself, unless it's with, a long-term partner. But even then, things are hackable on the internet. Anything in the cloud is hackable. I mean, it just is not conducive to a communicative, healthy relationship. So much of this. And so I think, you shouldn't be looking for recipes for anything online unless it's a recipe for food or something like that, a tutorial for knitting. But when there's another person involved, using porn as a tutorial or as an example of what you should be doing in your intimate relationships is horrific. And I think that a lot of that could be remedied by having more open conversations with people and destigmatizing conversations about sex and pleasure, and also encouraging people to take control of their sexuality and to understand it and to spend more time with it, because it is a huge part of the human experience. And it's something that, is so often weaponized against people of any age. And so the fact that you've put this book together and are sharing it widely and encouraging people to read it, as will we, is so important in, I feel like, combating the rape culture that allows all of this to exist. And so much of what allows the rape culture to exist in the first place is this sort of toxic information that we have online, including misinformation that people are just bombarded with on every platform on the internet, whether it's about our bodies, relationships, or, how you mentioned in your book and what I talked about earlier about what's normal. So why is it so important that young people learn not just from information, but also how to think critically about what they're hearing from the internet, from their peers, from their friends, and social media? I know social media is such a conducive platform to these personal anecdotes, as you mentioned in your book, that might not have facts behind them, although it's so easy to say, well, I know a person who this has happened to too, so that's okay, or that's normal. Could you explain to us what you'd imagine or what you dream people's discernment could look like?
Oh, that's great. Thank you. That's a great question. The problem with social media is that anyone can have a single experience and then talk about it on TikTok or Instagram and really sound like an expert in it. And as a healthcare provider, for example, when we do clinical studies like how well do birth control pills work, we don't just give it to one person and be like, okay, try to take it every day, try to take it at the same time, and let's check back with you in 6 months to see if you're still taking it, you're pregnant, or you're having side effects. And no, trials are done on hundreds of thousands of people before something has been FDA approved as safe, or we can say, these are the side effects you might experience from birth control pills, and this is the percent of people who have them. So from a healthcare perspective, like medical facts, and when a provider tells you, an IUD is a safe method of birth control, or this pill will clear up your chlamydia, or whatever they tell you, that is based on hundreds of thousands of people and research and clinical trials. And unfortunately, when people go on the internet and they sound like experts because one person has had one experience, you're not getting the 100,000 people who didn't have that problem because they didn't make a TikTok about it. So that's the issue. And I think I don't know, basically we all have to understand that what we see and hear on the internet may not be true, period. And I think as a parent or as an older sibling of a young child who's starting to look up everything on the internet, we have to teach people skills of like how to find actual facts on the internet, like which websites have integrity and are based on science. And it is very difficult. It's very difficult for an adult to do that, let alone a child. And so, again, I don't know what the solution is, but I do know that teaching kids critical thinking and to understand, because you can find a TikTok that swears one thing and then a TikTok that will swear the absolute opposite is true. And, so what are facts has become a complicated question. And, so that's why, especially around the methods of birth control, I wanted to lay out the pros, cons, what each method is like, and what is the actual clinical data on the methods, because there's been a lot of TikToks like, oh, birth control will make you gain weight, or birth control will make you do this or that. And the problem is when people do that, they're not looking at what is the opposite, what would be the side effect of not doing that, having sex, getting pregnant, and having a child. Like you gain weight, you gain nausea, you gain acne, you have bleeding. Plus, you're pregnant, you give birth, you parent a child for the next 18 years. That's a side effect of not using birth control. But, nobody makes that equation. so it's an ongoing problem. And so I just think access to information, access to resources, access to healthcare providers, and teaching kids that, TikTok is entertainment. It's not medical information is really important.
And it is such a great reminder too to engage more deeply with ourselves, especially as we're growing up, to really tunnel in and be like, well, what do I feel in this situation? What is right for me based on all the information that I've been presented with? Which I still need that reminder all the time about, kind of centering in and remembering when it comes to thinking about your reproductive health, when it comes to thinking about relationships, boundaries, consent, to really tunnel in and say, well, where do my priorities and boundaries lie? So thank you for that reminder.
As I was reading your book, I was thinking just about how important this book is for a variety of reasons, but also when it comes to just erasing shame and stigma, and how shame and stigma can silence people. I mean, before I joined I Have the Right To, I spent over a decade as an attorney representing survivors of sexual abuse. And, many of them went several decades before they ever told a soul what happened to them. And I think that it starts early on when we don't name, the correct names for body parts and private parts. We don't use those terms. We somehow associate some kind of shame with that. And then we don't talk about, what is going on in your body as you're getting older and going through puberty and maturing. And then when things happen to them, when there is some kind of abuse or, sexual harassment, people feel like they can't talk about it because we don't talk about that things when they're younger. We don't talk about our bodies. We don't feel empowered to know and understand our bodies. We don't get to know our nose, as you said. We don't, understand our boundaries. And so then when they're violated, we definitely don't know how to talk about that. And then when we do, even if you do talk about it, the people that you're talking about it to might think like, oh, we don't talk about that. And so then there's even more silence and stigma. And so I just think that this book, which is really so empowering for young people, can really help also just their ability to seek help and speak up and report when something's going on. And even though that wasn't like the sole purpose of your book, I really feel like that is what it can lead to when you have empowered people who understand themselves and understand their body and their options. Then I think they'll feel more empowered to speak up as well when something happens that shouldn't be happening, and feel like they have that support around them. My hope is that if a parent would hand this book to their child, hopefully their child then knows like, hey, you can talk to me about this stuff. And I think it's just such an important way of starting conversations. And, some of my friends that I recommended it to said, my teenager is never going to sit down and read a book. And I said, well, then you sit down and you read it and you have conversations based on what you learn in the book, because it really is important to have these conversations. So just, if you have any thoughts on that, Dena, I know I just kind of rambled for a minute, but I really think that knowledge is power, like we say, right? It really is power. And the more we give to young people and help them and guide them, the better.
Yeah, I loved everything you just said about that. Shame cloaks things in secrecy. And so this book does the opposite of that. It's just very clear information. It names body parts. It has diagrams of body parts. It talks about menstrual periods and sex and STIs and female orgasms and all the things that are often cloaked in shame because of our patriarchal society. That shame around female sexual health and safety has been one of the ways patriarchy has kept women controlled and kept women down. And it is liberating for all young people to get to talk about sex with accurate and just clear language. And I love that about my job because, I don't have to get into are you having sex? Or do you think you might have sex? Like, it doesn't matter. Let's tell you about sex and what you need to do to be safe and healthy around sex and have it be positive. So my book is in a way sex positive because it's like, yes, humans have sex, even teenagers have sex. And that's not in the discussion here, like whether or not someone's having sex. Here's the tools you need in case you do, in case you're thinking about it, in case you have, in case you are. That isn't even a part of the conversation here. It's just the information. And I really loved that about my job. That's where I'm positioned as the healthcare provider who comes in is like, okay, let's talk about birth control. It doesn't matter if you're 13, 18, 38 and have had 5 kids and are like, okay, enough now, or what? Like, here's the deal. And I love that about my job, my profession as a nurse midwife. It's like I've had a whole career dedicated to caring for women from a point of trying to lift them up with dignity and respect, whatever circumstances they're in. And, that's what I'm trying to do with my book. And it's been really hard to get the book out to people because, people don't read books. Books don't really matter. And, anyway, I made it and it exists and it's here for hopefully more and more people will find it and have it as another tool in their toolkit.
Yes. And to our listeners, this book does matter and you should read it and you should encourage the young people in your life to read it, even if that means sitting down and reading a chapter together, because I definitely recommend it 100%.
And for anybody who has a long drive or commute to work, it's on Spotify as well. It's available as an audiobook that I've listened to, and it's lovely. And now, Dena, as we close, we always ask our guests to complete their own I have the right to statement, a declaration of agency, dignity, and voice. Now, after everything that we've talked about today, if you were to finish the statement, I have the right to, for yourself and for the young people you wrote this book for, how would you complete it?
I have the right to decide whether, when, and with whom I get pregnant and have a baby.
If there was like a clapping ability on the I would do that. I don't know if they can hear this. Yeah.
Dena, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your wisdom, compassion, and expertise. Your work and It's Your Body offers young people the language, clarity, and confidence so many of us, including me, wish we had earlier. We're really grateful for the care that you bring to this conversation and for writing a book that truly meets young people where they are.
Thank you so much. Well, I really admire your organization. And Maria, I really admire you for doing this work as a university student and stepping up to represent your cohort over there in college. So thank you for being a part of this. And Chessy and Katie, your organization just looks amazing. I'm excited to learn more about what you do and maybe collaborate and keep on. We just got to keep on keeping on, everybody. And I will never stop. I will never stop working for the liberation and dignity of all. And so thank you. I know you guys are doing exactly the same thing.
Yes, thank you, Dena, for being here and for the work that you do every day to empower young women with knowledge and agency. We are so appreciative of this conversation and so glad that we get to share it with so many others.
And thank you so much. I third that. And I'm so excited to never stop, never stopping with you. And to all of our listeners, thank you for being a part of the Aspire community. We'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for listening. Like and subscribe to the podcast on all platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends about Aspire. Follow us on social media at I Have the Right To. Learn more about workshops and programming available for students, educators, parents, and community members at ihavetherightto.org.